Welcome to Pragim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 59 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll discuss about query strings in ASP.NET. Before continuing with the session, I strongly recommend to watch parts 56, 57, and 58 of this video series. In ASP.NET, there are different techniques to send data from one web form to another. We have discussed about cross-page postback and context.handler objects in the previous sessions of this video series. In this session, we'll discuss about query strings. The rest of the techniques, which include cookies, session state, and application state, will be discussed in the subsequent video sessions. Now, let's look at a simple example using query strings to send data from web form 1 to web form 2. I have an ASP.NET web application project here, which has got web form 1 and web form 2. On web form 1, I have two text box controls where the user can enter their name and email. And once they click this button, go to web form 2, the user will be navigated to webform2.aspx. And on this web form, I have two label controls which display the entered name and email. Now, let's double click this button control to get the event handler generated. And I'm going to use response.redirect technique to move the user from web form 1 to web form 2. So I want to navigate the user to webform2.aspx. So double quote tilde symbol. Tilde symbol indicates the root directory of the web application project. Within the root directory, I have a web form with name webform2.aspx. Okay. Now, what are query strings? Query strings are actually name value pairs. Okay, that can be appended to the URL of the page that we want to navigate to. And to indicate the beginning of the query string, we use query string. So to the name of the web form that we want to navigate to, I am appending question mark. So question mark indicates the beginning of the query string. And then you can give your query string any meaningful name that you want. Since I am using a query string to move the name of the user, you can call it name, or I'm calling here in my example username. So username is equal to, so this is the name of the query string, and the value, where is the value for this query string variable coming from? It's coming from txt name text box dot text. Okay, so that's the first query string. Now, it's possible to have more than one query string sent from one web form to another. Now, the first query string is indicated by the question mark. Okay, and then if you want to append more query strings to the URL, then you use the ampersand symbol. So plus double quotes again, ampersand. This indicates the beginning of another query string variable. Now, what else I want to send from web form 1 to web form 2? Email as well. So I'm going to say user email is equal to, and that's again the name of the query string variable. And where is the value coming from? The value is coming from txt email text box. That's it. So all we have done until now, to the web form that we want to navigate to, we used a question mark to indicate the beginning of a query string. That's the name of the query string variable, and the value is coming from txt name text box. And then this is another query string, which is we are appending another query string using the ampersand symbol, and then the value for that is coming from txt email. This way you can append as many query strings as you want. But then keep in mind there is a limit on the number of query strings that we can have in the URL. So there's a limit on the length. So obviously if you have too many fields that you want to send as part of using the query strings, then we cannot do that. Okay, alright, so that's the URL. So once the user clicks, he will be navigated to webform2.aspx, and then in the URL there will be this variable username with the value, and then user email with the value. Now the next task is to actually read that value from the URL and display it on these label controls on webform2.aspx. And to read a query string variable, we can use the request object. So we are using the request object dot, there is a query string property. So request object dot query string. And to read query strings, there are two ways. You can use the integral indexer, look at that, or I can use a string, the name of the query string. Now using the name of the query string is more readable rather than using the integral indexer. So I'm going to use the name. So the name is going to be user name, And what do we want to do with that? We want to display that in the label name. So label name.text is equal to that. And along the same lines, we want to retrieve user email query string. So user email, and I want to display that in label email. That's all it has got. Okay, so now let's go ahead and run that. So now we are moving the values that we enter on web form 1, that's name and email, to web form 2.aspx using query strings. So I'm going to enter the name. For example, let us say Sam is the name and prajim@prajimtech.com is the email. Okay, so now when I click go to web form 2, notice the URL. In the URL, along with the page that I want to navigate to, I have the question mark, which indicates the beginning of the query string. That's the first query string name and the value for that. The next query string with an ampersand symbol, that indicates the beginning of another query string, and then the value for that. And then what we are doing on web form 2, we are using the request object query string property to read the values from those respective query string variables. Okay, excellent. So now let's look at some of the points to remember about query strings. Query strings are name value pairs. Why do we say they're name value pairs? Because you have a query string variable name and a value. Query string variable name and a value. So they are name value pairs. Query strings is a very common way to send data from one web form to another. Okay, in real time we use query strings a lot. For example, there might be a grid view control on one web form, and then which displays the list of customers or employees. And then once I click on the name of the employee, maybe I'll move to the next web form, and then we load the data, the complete details of that employee based on their ID, and then display their details in the next web form. So we move the employee ID from one web form to another web form. Query strings are appended to the page URL, and the question mark indicates the beginning of a query string and its value. And it's possible to use more than one query string. The first query string is specified using the question mark. Subsequent query string can be appended to the URL using the ampersand symbol. There is a limit on the query string length, hence query strings cannot be used to send very long data. Query strings are visible to the user, hence should not be used to send sensitive information unless encrypted. So, query strings appear in clear text format, so they should definitely not be used to send, confidential information like credit card numbers, passwords, etc. To read the query string value, use a request objects query string property. That's what we have done on webform2.aspx. To read the query string value on the destination page, we are using the request objects query string property. And then you can either use the name of the query string or the integer index, for example, instead of username, because we know in the URL the first query string is username and the second query string is user email. So here within the code, instead of username, I can say 0 and then 1 for the next query string. Okay, so now for example, if we run this as it stands, let's close that browser window. Let me run this. When the web form loads, we can enter the name and email, but on the destination now we are using the integral indexer instead of the name of the query string. But using the names of the query strings is suggested because they are more readable. So go to web form 2, look at that, I get them as expected. So we use the request objects query string property and ampersand symbol. If you look at the URL here, this ampersand symbol in the URL has got a meaning. It is used to separate query string, query strings. If you have multiple query strings, ampersand is used to separate them. But then let's say on my web form, I enter the name as, let's say for example, Sam and Tom. That's the name of the user. Now when I say go to web form 2, look at what's going to happen. It says Sam, and look at that, it displays Tom as the email. But if you look at web form 2, what did I expect? I expect test as my email. But look at that, it displays Tom. That's because, look at what's going to happen. Username is equal to Sam, and then the space that I entered, if you look at that, Sam, there is a space. Space is now encoded to %20, and then there is the ampersand symbol. If you remember, ampersand symbol indicates the beginning of another query string. And if you look at our code, what we are doing on the destination page, we are saying request.queryString of first one. So this is the first query string and this is the second query string. Okay, so now it is considering Tom as the second query string value because there is an ampersand. And look at that, just before Tom there is a slight space, and that's coming as %20. That's how it is encoded. And then Tom, so that's %20, which is nothing but space, and Tom, it's treating both of them as the value for the next query string parameter, which is not true, because what we wanted was we wanted to treat ampersand as a value for username query string. Okay, so how do we properly encode them? So to properly encode ampersand symbol, look at that, ampersand symbol is used to concatenate two query strings. So if you want to send ampersand as a value for the query string, there are two ways. One is basically you can use the server.url encode method. Let's see how to use that. So when we send them on the source web form, I'm going to say server dot, there's a method called URL encode which will encode the value that you enter into the text box. And similarly, I'm going to do the same thing for the email. So server dot URL encode. And then now let's run the web form and see what's going to happen. Now what's going to happen when we enter ampersand as the value of one of the query string parameters within the text boxes. Look at that. I'm going to enter Sam and Tom, and then maybe email at email as email. So when I click this go to web form 2, look at that, now it's displaying as expected. That's because look at that, it's properly encoding that Sam, the space is encoded as plus, and ampersand symbol is encoded as %26. So that's how URL encode method is encoding the ampersand symbol. And then on the destination page, it's automatically decoding that and displaying it as expected, Sam and Tom email. So now it's working as expected. So one way to encode the URL is to use server.url encode. The other way is to simply replace the ampersand symbol with %26. That's we are manually encoding the string there. So what I can basically do here is txt_name.text dot replace. So that's a string function, and what we want to replace, we want to replace ampersand with %26. That's the encoded value for ampersand. So %26. And we can do the same thing for the email as well. So instead of server.url encode, I'm going to say textemail.text.replace, and I'm going to replace ampersand with %26. So %26. That's it. So let's go ahead and run this as it stands. But personally, I prefer using server.url encode over replacing the ampersand symbol with %26. So let's say Sam and Tom and email as test. I click go to web form 2, and it works as expected because it's replacing that ampersand with %26. Okay. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.